The ushers again called silence, and Mr. Skimpin proceeded to open the case, and the case appeared to have very little inside it when he had opened it, for he kept such particulars as he knew completely to himself, and sat down after a lapse of 3 minutes, leaving the jury in precisely the same advanced stage of wisdom as they were in before.
"You have heard from my learned friends, gentlemen,"
said Mr. Sergeant Bosphorus, well knowing that, from the learned friend alluded to, the gentlemen of the jury had just heard absolutely nothing.
"You have heard from my learned friend, gentlemen, that this is an action for breach of promise of marriage, in which the damages are laid at £1,500. But you have not heard from my learned friend, gentlemen, inasmuch as it did not come within my learned friend's province to tell you what are the facts and circumstances of this case. Those facts and circumstances, gentlemen, you shall hear detailed by me, and proved to you by the unimpeachable female whom I will place in that box before you. The plaintiff is a widow. Yes, gentlemen, a widow. The late Mr. Bardell, after enjoying for many years the esteem and confidence of his sovereign as one of the guardians of his royal revenues, glided almost imperceptibly from the world to seek elsewhere for that repose and comfort which a custom house can never afford.
This was a pathetic description of the decease of Mr. Bardell, who had been struck on the head with a quart pot in a public-house cellar.
Some time before Mr. Bardell's death, he had stamped his likeness on little boy. With this little boy, the only pledge of her departed exciseman, Mrs. Bardell shrank from the world and courted the retirement and tranquillity of Goswell Street. And here she placed in her front parlour window a written placard bearing this inscription: "Apartments furnished for a single gentleman. Inquire within."
"Mr. Bardell," said the widow,
"Mr. Bardell was a man of honour.
Mr. Bardell was a man of his word. Mr. Bardell was no deceiver. Mr. Bardell was once a single gentleman himself.
To a single gentleman, then, shall my lodgings be let, actuated by this beautiful and touching impulse. The lonely and desolate widow dried her tears, furnished her first floor, caught her innocent boy to her maternal bosom, and put the bill up in the parlour window. Did it remain there long? No! The servant was on the watch, the train was late, but I was preparing the supper and the miner was at work! Before the bill had been in the parlour window 3 days, gentlemen. 3 days! A being erect upon 2 legs, and bearing all the outward semblance of a man, and not of a monster, knocked at Mrs. Bardell's door. That man was Pickwick. Pickwick, the defendant.
Sergeant Bosphorus here paused for breath. The silence woke Mr. Justice Stanley, who immediately wrote down something with a pen without ink in it, and looked unusually profound, to impress the jury that he always thought most deeply with his eyes shut.
Let me tell the defendant Pickwick, if he be in court, that I am informed he is, that it would have been more decent in him, more becoming, in better judgment, and in better taste, if he had stopped away. I shall show you, gentlemen, that for 2 years Pickwick continued to reside constantly and without interruption or intermission at Mrs. Bardell's house. I shall show you that. On many occasions he gave halfpence, and on some occasions even sixpence. Ah, little boy. And I shall prove to you, by a witness whose testimony it will be impossible for my learned friend to weaken or controvert, that on one occasion he patted the boy on the head, and after inquiring whether he had won any amet or horse or common knees lately, both of which I understand to be a particular species of marble much prized by the youth of this town, made use of this remarkable expression. How should you like to have another father? I shall prove to you, gentlemen, on the testimony of his own friends. Most unwilling witnesses, gentlemen, most unwilling witnesses. And on that morning he was discovered by them holding the plaintiff in his arms and soothing her agitation by his caresses and endearments. 2 letters have passed between these parties, letters which are admitted to be in the handwriting of the defendant. Let me read the first. Garraways, 12 o'clock. Dear Mrs. B, chops and tomato sauce. Yours, Pickwick. Gentlemen, what does this mean? Chops, gracious heavens, and tomato sauce. Gentlemen, is the happiness of a sensitive and confiding female to be trifled away by such shallow artifices as these? The next has no date whatever, which is in itself suspicious. Dear Mrs. B, don't trouble yourself about the warming pan. The warming pan! Why, gentlemen, who does trouble himself about a warming pan? When was the peace of mind of man or woman broken or disturbed by a warming pan, which is in itself a harmless, a useful, and, I will add, gentlemen, a comforting article of domestic furniture? Why is Mrs. Bardell so earnestly entreated not to agitate herself about this warming pan, unless it is, as I assert it to be, a mere cover for hidden fire, a mere substitute for some endearing word or promise, agreeable to a preconcerted system of correspondence, artfully contrived by Pickwick with a view to his contemplated desertion, and which I am not in a condition to explain. Enough of this. My client's hopes and prospects are ruined. But Pickwick, gentlemen, Pickwick, the ruthless destroyer of his domestic oasis in the desert of Goswell Street. Pickwick, who comes before you today with his heartless tomato sauce and warming pans. Pickwick still rears his head with unblushing effrontery, and gazes without a sigh on the ruin he has made. Damages, gentlemen. Heavy damages is the only punishment with which you can visit him, the only recompense that you can award to my client. And for these damages, she now appeals to an enlightened, a high-minded, a right-feeling, a conscientious, a dispassionate, a sympathizing, a contemplative jury of her civilized countrymen. Call Elizabeth Clubbins! Oh, pray compose yourself, ma'am. Of course, directly Mrs. Clubbins was desired to compose herself, she sobbed with increased vehemence, and gave alarming manifestations of an approaching fainting fit, or, as she afterwards said, of her feelings being too many for her.